Welcome back. Well, everyone loves a spooky Halloween story. Our next guest tells stories for a living, and she's got some ghost tales that will send chills down your spine. Plus, she has some tips on making sure your family and friends stay on the edge of their seats no matter what story you're telling. Professional storyteller Marilyn McPhie joins us this morning. Welcome to the show.
Thanks. I'm glad to be here.
All right, so my producer tells me you have a story that's going to make us shiver.
Well, I hope so. It's a true story, or at least a story that was told to me as true by a babysitter when I was a kid. He said that there was a girl who was about my age who liked to put pennies on railroad tracks, and she had a whole collection of pennies. And everything was fine most of the time, but one day the train just hit those pennies exactly wrong, derailed the whole train. There was a huge train wreck, and it killed everybody on board, 167 people. So that night, Rosemary was asleep when she heard a low rumble of a train, and then it got louder and louder and faster and faster and closer, and then it crashed through the wall of her bedroom. And as it did, the 167 ghosts of those 167 people shrieked accusingly at her, and then the train disappeared in the opposite wall. And night after night that happened. Of course, it didn't hurt the wall because it was a ghost train. But of course, Rosemary didn't sleep at all. And finally, she went completely crazy. Her parents had to put her in a mental institution with bars on the windows and locks on the doors. But that didn't stop the ghost train. Every night it came through, crashing through, clickety-clack, woo-woo, rumble, rumble, smashing through the walls. And the 167 ghosts shrieked accusingly. And finally, Rosemary did go completely crazy. And even though there were bars on the windows and locks on the doors, she escaped from that mental institution and went down the road and stood on the railroad tracks where a train, a real train, not a ghost train, came along. And that was the end of Rosemary. And my babysitter said, well, good night. And he turned out the light and closed the door. And I thought, I put pennies on tracks. That could happen to me. And so I was so terrified that I made a vow that I would never put pennies on the tracks again. And I didn't for about, 30 years. And then as a grown-up, I thought, oh, that was so mean of that babysitter to tell me that really scary story. That could never happen. And so in a small town in Tennessee at a storytelling festival, I thought, you know, I'm going to tell my kids that story. I'll tell them a story from my childhood, and I'll bring them a flattened penny. So I put 5 pennies on the railroad tracks that ran through the town, one for each of my kids, and I waited for the train to come by. And I picked up the pennies all smooth and warm, and I was so pleased with myself. But the next day, they made a big announcement. They said, well, you know, here are the porta potties and no flash photography. And oh, by the way, we got a phone call from the Amtrak people saying they'd seen somebody putting something on the track. And you can't do that. It's completely illegal. And anybody who's caught doing it is subject to legal prosecution and fines. And so for the second time in my life, I made a vow never to put pennies on the tracks. Only this time, I was not so much scared of the ghosts as I was of lawyers.
And that's
a really scary story, the lawyers.
That's a true story.
Yes.
And the other one, true story, at least as told by your babysitter.
He said it was true, and I was completely convinced. That's what ghost stories are supposed to do, right? Completely convince you.
That was mean. And then he just turned out the light and said, good night, see you later.
Yeah, and left me there to shiver.
All right, so you say that there's some simple things that parents could do, ghost story or not, to really help captivate their kids' attentions.
Right, there are. I think that the first thing you have to do is you have to be willing to tell the stories. You have to think about the stories that you want to tell. You bring the kids in close. You don't be afraid to ham it up. Use some voices and gestures and make it bigger than life. Be really sort of exciting. And then I think one of the really important things to do is to make sure that you tell your kids the important stories. The stories about you when you were a child and the things that you did, the games you played, your friends, your school, your triumphs, your disasters, things like that. And where your family came from, why they're here, why they came to America, why they came to San Diego, what they do, what's important to them. And then experts say that probably the most important story you can tell your child is the story of how that child joined your family. The anticipation and the excitement that you had, thinking about the perfect name for this child. It places that child in a position of importance in your family that is really good. And then you just don't wait for the perfect movie-type scene to sit and tell a fabulous story to your child. You pick the times whenever you can, at the breakfast table or in the car or in the waiting room at the doctor's office. You just tell as many stories as you can as often as you can.
Perfect. All right. And there's a couple of chances to see you.
Right.
Right, at the Central Library.
Central Library on
this
Thursday. Yes. And then, and that's for kids. And then this Saturday, Halloween, there's a scary story concert, a storytelling concert for adults, people over 12, and that's in Poway at Templars Hall. A lot of other opportunities to see storytellers.
That was a scary picture of you, by the way.
Was it? Yeah. Well.
Your eyes wide open there. Professional storyteller Marilyn McPhie, thank you so much.
Thanks for having me here.
Great story.
All right. Hope
Sent
you
chills
live
down my
happily ever
spine.
after.
Oh, thank you. No pennies on the tracks. Ruben is live at the Del Mar Scaregrounds. Ruben, what you got?
We are live. We are live. Oh my goodness, Linda, we are live, girl.